She closes the door to her home. She sets her keys down on the table. Hours have passed since the date, yet she keeps thinking about the same moment. It wasn't a brilliant line. It wasn't a gift. It wasn't even a kiss. The truth is that certain subtle physical gestures have a far deeper emotional impact than most men realize. Today, you're going to discover 7 forms of touch that can strengthen the feeling of connection when mutual interest already exists, the psychological research behind them, and the exact sequence that makes them effective. And number 5 is often the one that lingers in a woman's mind long after the date has ended. But before we talk about the first touch, there's something that completely changes the way this topic should be understood. Most men believe attraction begins when a woman hears the right words. However, decades of research on human communication suggest something different. A large portion of what we feel toward another person is built through nonverbal signals: eye contact, tone of voice, presence, and, when mutual comfort exists, physical touch. Dr. Tiffany Field, director of the Touch Research Institute at the University of Miami, has spent more than 30 years studying how human touch influences our emotions. Her research has found that certain forms of physical contact can promote the release of oxytocin, reduce stress levels, and increase feelings of closeness between two people. But here's the detail almost nobody talks about. Not all touch creates connection. Some forms of contact communicate trust. Others create immediate discomfort. And the difference rarely has anything to do with force or duration. It has everything to do with context, timing, and the relationship that already exists between two people. This is especially true with a mature woman, because an experienced woman doesn't simply evaluate what you do. She evaluates how you do it. She notices whether your actions feel natural or calculated, whether they come from genuine connection or from an obvious strategy. That's why the first gesture on this list seems so simple that most men barely pay attention to it, and that's exactly where its power lies. Touch number 1, the shoulder. Not a rough pat, not an exaggerated gesture, just a brief, natural touch that accompanies a moment of shared connection. Maybe you're laughing together. Maybe she has just told a funny story. And for 1 or 2 seconds, your hand rests gently on her shoulder while you share that moment. Nothing more. It seems insignificant, but a study conducted by researchers at the University of Oxford found that light physical contact in socially acceptable areas can activate brain circuits associated with positive feelings and reward. What's interesting is that this gesture often goes unnoticed by the conscious mind. It doesn't feel like a tactic. It doesn't feel like pressure. It feels like closeness. And that difference changes everything. Many times, a woman can't explain exactly why she feels comfortable with someone. She simply feels that the conversation flows naturally, the energy feels good, and being around that person feels easy. What she may not consciously notice is that small, respectful, and well-timed physical signals quietly contribute to creating that feeling. But there's one essential rule. The touch should disappear before it draws attention to itself. 2 seconds, maybe 3. Then you continue the conversation as though nothing happened. Because naturalness is exactly what gives it value. And now we move to the second gesture, one that communicates something entirely different. Not comfort, not familiarity, but a very particular combination of closeness and protection that the brain interprets in a surprisingly powerful way. Touch number 2, the middle of her back. This gesture happens while moving, not during a deep conversation, not while sitting face to face. It happens when you're both walking. Maybe you're leaving a restaurant. Maybe you're crossing a busy street. Maybe you're moving through a crowd, and for just a few seconds, your hand gently rests on the middle of her back to guide the direction of movement. The gesture seems small, but psychologically, it communicates much more than most people imagine. Why? Because the back is an area that rarely receives contact from strangers. The brain classifies it as a more personal space than the shoulder or arm. As a result, when touch occurs within a natural and appropriate context, it's often interpreted as a signal of closeness. Body language experts have observed for years that this type of gesture can communicate two messages at the same time. I'm paying attention to you, and simultaneously, you can feel comfortable with me. That combination is especially powerful because it brings together two fundamental emotional needs: safety and connection. Now, this is where many men make the mistake that completely destroys the effect. They confuse guidance with control. Those are two very different things. A mature woman can usually recognize that difference immediately. If the gesture feels like an attempt to direct her, push her, or invade her space, the positive feeling disappears. But when it arises naturally, almost invisibly, the brain registers it differently, as presence, as consideration, as someone who is paying attention. And that creates something very interesting. Because attraction rarely grows from grand displays. It usually grows from an accumulation of small moments that make someone feel good when they're with you. Moments so subtle that they often aren't consciously remembered. Only the feeling remains. And that feeling is what lasts. I remember a conversation with a friend who described this perfectly. She couldn't explain what she liked about a man she was dating. She wasn't talking about his appearance. She wasn't talking about his messages. She wasn't talking about gifts or spectacular plans. The only thing she kept repeating was, "I feel incredibly calm when I'm with him." That was it. And when she reflected on their time together, the same pattern kept appearing over and over again. Small gestures of attentiveness, small gestures of care. Nothing exaggerated, nothing theatrical, just the consistent feeling that he was truly present. But the next touch goes even deeper, because it no longer communicates comfort. It no longer communicates protection. It communicates something neuroscientists find fascinating: the ability of two people to enter, quite literally, into emotional synchrony. And it can all begin with something as simple as a hand. Touch number 3, the hand. And although it may seem like the simplest touch on this entire list, it is probably one of the most underrated. Because it isn't really about the touch itself. It's about when it happens. Imagine this situation. She's telling you something important. Not a superficial story, something that genuinely matters to her. A concern, a difficult experience, a memory that still affects her. At that moment, most people do the same thing. They interrupt. They offer advice. They try to solve the problem. They start talking about themselves. But research on emotional connection reveals something interesting. Feeling understood is often far more powerful than receiving an immediate solution. And this is where this gesture comes in. When mutual trust exists and the moment allows for it, gently placing your hand over hers for a few seconds can communicate something that words sometimes fail to express. I hear you. I'm here. You don't have to carry this alone. A study conducted by researchers at the Weizmann Institute of Science in Israel found evidence that physical contact between two people can promote physiological and emotional synchronization. In other words, our bodies respond to the presence of others in ways that are much deeper than most of us realize. That's why this gesture functions differently from the previous ones. The shoulder creates comfort. The back communicates presence. The hand communicates support. And a mature woman will often recognize that difference with remarkable clarity. Because experience has taught her that there are men who listen in order to respond, and men who listen in order to understand. The difference may seem small, but emotionally, it is enormous. In fact, many connections fail for a surprisingly simple reason. Both people speak, both people hear, but neither person feels truly heard. That's why context is everything here. This doesn't happen during an argument. It doesn't happen in the middle of a lighthearted conversation. It happens when vulnerability appears, when she lowers her guard, when she reveals a part of herself that she doesn't show to everyone. And if that moment is handled with respect and authenticity, something changes. Because it stops feeling like a conversation and starts feeling like a connection. Now, the next touch is completely different because it no longer exists within the realm of emotional comfort. It enters a much more delicate territory. A territory where attraction stops being implied and begins to become conscious. And that is precisely why it is one of the gestures most men get wrong. Touch number 4. The knee. This is the touch that separates comfort from romantic tension. Because it can no longer be easily mistaken for simple friendliness, it no longer feels entirely neutral. And that is exactly why it requires more emotional intelligence than any of the previous gestures. I'm talking about a brief touch on the knee. Now, before continuing, there's something important to understand. This gesture only makes sense when a positive dynamic already exists, mutual trust has been established, and there are clear signs of interest from both people. Without those elements, it stops being connection and becomes intrusion. And that's why so many men fail here. Not because the gesture itself is wrong, but because they ignore the context. Psychologist Monica Moore, known for her research on courtship signals and nonverbal communication, spent years observing how small physical touches could influence perceptions of closeness when mutual attraction already existed. What's fascinating is that the intermediate zones of personal space generate a different response than purely social zones. The brain pays closer attention, not necessarily because the contact is intense, but because it carries meaning. And attraction often grows precisely there, in meaning, not intensity. Imagine the scene. You're sitting together, the conversation flows naturally, both of you are laughing, there's that pleasant feeling where neither person is overthinking what to say next. You're simply enjoying the moment. And during a shared laugh, your hand briefly touches her knee as you react to something she just said. An instant, nothing more. The important part is not the touch. The important part is what happens afterward. Because emotionally secure people don't need to insist. They don't need to force anything. They don't need to turn a small gesture into a major event. They simply remain present. And that communicates confidence. In fact, there's something many mature women find especially attractive. It's not boldness, it's self-control. Because they've met men who were too passive to show interest, and they've also met men who were too impulsive to respect boundaries. But the man who knows how to calibrate, the man who understands timing, the man who can express interest without creating pressure, that is often the man who remains in her mind. And here is an idea that almost nobody mentions. Attraction is rarely built through one big moment. More often, it is built through a sequence of positive experiences that gradually increase feelings of closeness. Each step prepares the next. Each gesture creates context for the one that follows. And that brings us to the 5th touch, the one many women remember for years, the one that can completely transform the emotional intensity of a moment. Because it doesn't involve only physical contact, it involves identity. And once you understand why, you'll understand why this gesture creates such a different effect from all the others. Touch number 5, her hair. The fifth touch involves something many women consider an extension of their own identity, their hair. And that's exactly what makes it different. Because when we talk about hair, we're not merely talking about appearance. We're talking about something deeply personal. Think about it. How much time does a woman spend caring for it? How many decisions does she make about it? How many comments has she heard about it throughout her life? For many women, their hair is part of how they express themselves to the world. That's why the brain doesn't interpret this gesture as just another touch. It interprets it as something much more intimate. Research published in the journal Human Nature has linked mutual caregiving behaviors, including touching hair within close relationships, to the strengthening of emotional bonds. This isn't new. In fact, these behaviors appear repeatedly throughout our social biology. But here's the critical part. This is probably the gesture with the biggest difference between doing it right and doing it wrong. Because if it happens too soon, it can feel invasive. And once someone feels their boundaries have been crossed, it is very difficult to restore that sense of comfort. However, when it happens at the right moment, the effect can be surprisingly powerful. So, when is the right moment? Not during the first conversation, not while you're still trying to get to know each other. It's when a clear connection already exists, when the tension has faded, when both people feel comfortable, when eye contact lasts a little longer than usual, when silence no longer feels awkward, when the conversation stops feeling like an interview and begins to feel like genuine closeness. Maybe a strand of hair falls across her face. Maybe the wind moves it. And naturally, gently, and respectfully, you move it aside while maintaining eye contact. Nothing exaggerated, nothing theatrical. That is precisely where its power lies. Because this gesture communicates attention. It shows that you're present, that you notice details, that your focus is genuinely on her. And people remember how you made them feel noticed far more than they remember the exact words you used. There's something fascinating that often happens afterward. Many times, a woman won't remember the sentence that accompanied the moment. She won't remember the exact topic of conversation. But she will remember exactly how she felt. And emotions are what remain. Emotions are what return hours later, what resurface the next day, what makes someone smile without realizing it while remembering a date. Yet we still haven't reached the touch that most deeply influences the feeling of emotional bonding. Because the next gesture possesses something none of the others on this list have. It doesn't last only a few seconds. It can literally change the body's chemistry. Reduce stress, increase feelings of safety, and break down emotional barriers that some people spent years building. All thanks to something most of us do without even thinking about it. A hug. Touch number 6, the extended hug. The sixth touch is the extended hug. And no, I'm not talking about those awkward hugs that seem to last forever. I'm talking about something much simpler. A hug that lasts just a few seconds longer than usual. Long enough to stop feeling like an automatic greeting and begin to feel like an emotional experience. Dr. Karen Gruen and Dr. Kathleen Light, researchers at the University of North Carolina, studied how certain forms of affectionate physical contact affect the human body. Their findings showed that warm, prolonged hugs can promote the release of oxytocin and help reduce physiological indicators associated with stress. In simple terms, a good hug can make someone feel calmer, safer, and more connected. Not because it's magic, because it's biology. And this is where the gesture takes on a special meaning. Many people enter new relationships carrying experiences from the past. Disappointments, losses, broken promises, moments that taught them to protect themselves. Over time, they build a kind of emotional armor, not because they want to push others away, but because they don't want to get hurt again. What's interesting is that emotional armor rarely disappears through arguments or explanations. It doesn't disappear because someone says, "You can trust me." It disappears when experiences begin to prove it. And a sincere hug can become one of those experiences. Because for a few seconds, the need to impress disappears. The need to find the perfect words disappears. The performance disappears. All that remains are two people sharing a genuine moment. The best time for this hug is usually at the end of a positive experience, when both of you have enjoyed spending time together, when comfort already exists, when neither person is in a hurry to leave. Most goodbyes happen almost on autopilot. A quick gesture, a smile, and each person goes their separate way. But when someone takes a few extra seconds to truly hug you, something curious happens. The moment gains emotional weight. It becomes memorable. Because our brains don't remember every detail of an experience, they especially remember how the experience ended. And that has enormous implications for attraction. There are people we forget quickly, and there are people whose presence stays with us long after they've gone. Many times, the difference lies in how they made us feel during the final moments we shared with them. But now we arrive at the final touch, the most delicate, the most powerful, and also the easiest to ruin, because it requires something that none of the previous gestures require to the same degree: deep trust. Without it, the effect disappears. With it, it can completely change the way a woman perceives you. And that's why it should always be the final step in this sequence. Touch number 7, the neck. And now we arrive at the 7th touch, the most powerful of all. Not because it's the most intense, but because it demands the highest level of trust. I'm talking about contact with the neck. And to understand why it has such an impact, you first need to understand what this area represents to the human brain. The neck is one of the most vulnerable areas of the body. From a biological perspective, protecting it has always been a priority for survival. That's why when we allow someone into that personal space, we're communicating something very profound. Trust. Not attraction, not interest. Trust. Attraction can appear quickly. Trust cannot. Trust is built. Trust is earned. And that is exactly why this gesture occupies the final position on the list. Neuroscience research has shown that the neck contains a high concentration of nerve endings and is closely connected to responses of the autonomic nervous system. This means that a gentle and appropriate interaction in this area can create a very particular combination of emotional relaxation and heightened emotional awareness. It's a feeling that is difficult to describe, but many people recognize it immediately when they experience it. Now, this is where most people make a mistake. When they hear about this gesture, they imagine something exaggerated, something obvious, something dramatic. And that's exactly where they destroy its effect. Because the true power of this touch lies in its subtlety. It may be the brush of your fingers as you gently move her hair aside. It may be the natural movement of a hand sliding from her cheek toward her neck during a moment of deep emotional connection. It may be an instant so brief that it almost goes unnoticed, but emotionally, it doesn't go unnoticed at all, because it communicates something very specific: closeness, presence, security. And when a woman has already developed trust in you, those messages carry tremendous meaning. The most important lesson. However, I want to repeat something that I consider more important than any technique mentioned in this video. None of these 7 touches works on its own, and neither should it, because the real factor that creates connection has never been physical contact itself. It's the intention behind the contact. Two people can perform exactly the same gesture and produce completely different results. Why? Because one person does it from a place of genuine interest, and the other does it from a place of manipulation. And the difference is noticeable, especially to a mature woman, because experience develops an extraordinary sensitivity for detecting when someone is being authentic and when someone is simply following a strategy. That's why these 7 touches are not tricks, they are amplifiers. They amplify what already exists. If respect exists, they increase closeness. If trust exists, they strengthen the bond. If mutual interest exists, they help express it. But if those elements are missing, no gesture in the world can replace them. In the end, emotional connection always works the same way. First comes attention. Then trust appears. After that comes closeness. And only then does that feeling we call love begin to emerge. Most people try to start at the end. The strongest relationships always begin at the beginning. Because when someone feels seen, understood, and valued, touch stops being just touch. It becomes meaning. And that is what people truly remember. Not the gesture itself, but how that gesture made them feel. Closing. If you found this topic helpful, in the video appearing on your screen, we dive deeper into the psychological patterns that cause a woman to move from feeling interested to feeling deeply connected. Because physical touch is only one piece of the puzzle. Understanding how emotional connection works as a whole completely transforms the way you build relationships. Click now and continue watching. And if you enjoyed this video, subscribe for more content on psychology and relationships. People forget words. They rarely forget how you made them feel.